The following episode has sexual themes and mildly explicit language. The content was made for a mature audience. Viewer discretion is advised. Hi everyone, welcome to Saris on Screen. I'm Usha,
And I'm Rekha.
and we're talking about South Asian politics, patriarchy, and pop culture. Catch us every other Friday as we do feminist deep dives into Desi culture and cinema. In today's episode, we're asking if modern feminist narratives in Bollywood today are doing enough. To start this, we are going to introduce our test for everything. We're calling it the sauce test, lol. But let's have Rekha bring us to the first point in it.
With South Asian media, especially Bollywood, we tend to see some very specific identities represented over and over again without really showing that diversity of South Asia. So I think what we need to ask ourselves here is there at least one diverse South Asian identity, whether it's in terms of ethnicity, language, religion, caste, gender, sexuality, and are they being tokenized in the representations, or are they given the space to be full characters?
Yeah, and that brings us to our second question. Are the women and the marginalized characters portrayed with agency? Do they have their own desires, their motivations, their own character arcs and backgrounds? Are they achieving more for themselves than just fulfilling the character arc of the cishet male in the story? And I think that is a very important question to ask, because a lot of the representation that we currently have of women and marginalized characters are mostly just tokens.
Yeah, and I think when we talk about like marginalized characters and their agency, we also need to think about the power dynamics that exist between different, like at different intersections of people's identities. And these power dynamics are sometimes used again for comedic effect. And our next question is actually about, are the women and marginalized characters in the movie or TV show aware of the power dynamics of their identities and how society views them?
And I think it's just very important to look at the power dynamics when examining agency, because when you have the agency that a character exhibits is not separate from their identities in society, and their ability to exhibit agency is always affected by the power dynamics of society. So when you have a rich upper caste, upper class woman, their lived experiences or how they exhibit or are allowed to exhibit agency will not be the same as someone of marginalized caste, marginalized gender identity, of a more economically disadvantaged position. And when taking that into account, I think it's important to ask if the movie is doing a sufficient enough job of showing the nuances of their identity and how it stacks in the hierarchy of greater societal everything.
Absolutely. I think those power dynamics tend to define how these characters relate to each other as well, because the relationship between two women of different economic positions or different caste locations or even gender identities for that matter is really different from two women who are either economically similarly positioned or have similar upbringings. And that brings us to our next question, which is, do these women and marginalized characters have meaningful relationships with each other that are independent of the main male cishet character who may be the protagonist?
And I think that brings us to our final question. Does the movie itself challenge any flawed notions in society, whether it be capitalism, casteism, gender discrimination, discrimination against queer people, or anything else? Like, I think when we're watching feminist movies, I think it's okay to have the expectation that that their narratives are going to be challenging some of these flawed ideas in societies instead of upholding more of them.
The movies that we're watching this week are some of the latest movies and shows to come out of Bollywood, and they've either claimed to tackle feminist issues or have actually done them. And while our sauce meter might not be conclusive, we hope that looking at these issues will give you a preview to what mainstream Bollywood media has done well and what it seriously needs to improve upon.
So, what are the issues that we value in modern feminism? And I think when we really get into it, objectification of women on screen is one of the most primary things that we want to see like subverted when we're watching a piece of media or film. So the male gaze in cinema is this idea that came about from this piece by Laura Mulvey in her essay Visual Pleasures and Narrative Cinema, where she uses psychoanalysis to like look at how much the media that we consumed is framed by male desires. And in her paper, she presents the 3 point of views that films are usually shaped around. First, being the person or the camera recording the film. Second, the characters within the film. And third, the audience watching the film. And some of the questions that you can ask, like based on this, is the story being told by a woman? Are the women the subjects of the film? And are they presented only as the objects of desire for the men within the film and for the audience? And the male gaze is essentially just, where you have a male director or at least someone who is very masculizing like the audience like through their gaze with the camera angles and everything, like like the quintessential shots that we all know, like the tits, the ass, the like walking the legs coming up, like yeah, like that is a quintessential camera for the male gaze. Then we see the characters within the film. How are they treating the women in the film? Is the woman being looked at? Is her agency being respected? How much is she valued in her like position within the film? And lastly, what is the audience taking from all this? Like, what is the audience being just told to look at this woman as an object because she, the camera, and the characters within it look at her as the object? There's this overall effect of masculization of the audience. And the feminine gaze is essentially a subverting of that. And there's like a whole talk that Joy Solway did a couple of years ago where they identify 3 main things that would make a good story that employs the feminine gaze. And the first thing is the idea of prioritizing feelings over action, and not to say that like, oh, it'll be just a sappy like feeling story, not that there's anything wrong with it, but it's a story that gains momentum through the emotional journey of the character. And then there's the gazed gaze, where the audience gets to experience being the object of the gaze. So normally when you see like a male gaze scene, you're the person who's looking at the woman and she's the object that you get to like take visual pleasure from. But on the other hand, in like a feminine gaze setup, like you'd get to see the characters look at you and you'd be confronted with their gaze. And lastly, there's this element of returning the gaze, which is where the recipient of your gaze will tell you how you feel. It's usually where you'll have a character on screen that you've been looking at all this time tell you how they feel about being looked at.
I think the interesting thing about the male gaze also is how often it shows up through things like item songs. I mean, the term itself is inherently objectifying, and we've seen so many actresses who have had to make their careers on item songs, and there's nothing wrong with that. Obviously, women should be able to express their sexuality and use their bodies the way they like, but the fact that so many of these people feel compelled to participate in their own sexualization because that's the only way to go forward in an industry like Bollywood is, I think, kind of really heartbreaking. And we've seen actresses like Katrina Kaif, Malika Arora, Bipasha Basu, and Rakhi Sawant pretty much make their careers on things like item songs.
Yeah, and I think it becomes so like especially degrading when you even just think about like like what it's called, like items, like we've all heard like, oh, like this item and this thought, and it's just like this dehumanizing and like objectifying like sort of premise. Not, and that's the thing, like I think we want to reiterate that we're not vilifying the sexualities of these women, but the objectification and the sexualization of these women. And this also can be seen in like the movies overall, in like a lot of the Bollywood films that we watch, where women are either the objects of the scene or the entire plot. And I think one good example would be like these sex scenes that we see on screen, where like women rarely get to show like agency.
And women are constantly just being like lusted after, right? Even when, I mean, I think recently, especially with things like Netflix and Amazon Prime and sort of South Asian online media platforms coming up, we see a little bit of loosening up on sex scenes in Bollywood. They used to be, two roses like touching each other some time ago, but now we're seeing like sex scenes actually happen or kissing scenes actually happen. But women in these scenes rarely tend to have any agency. They're just being thrown around or literally fucked at different points. And it's always so animalistic. It's very dehumanizing, not just to the women in the scene, but like all of the characters.
And I think it's also like dehumanizing for the audience that is like viewing this, because you have this like scene that is done purely from like this like voyeuristic male gaze, and there's this like overall masculization of the audience, and this leaves like the women who are watching this as like distant spectators, where they're watching other women on screen but as like objects. And I think that has like such an adverse effect.
Absolutely. I mean, as a woman watching other women get fucked, not to be crass, but literally get fucked on screen, my idea of my sexuality is going to be so distorted, right? That my whole idea of sex is then going to become something that a man wants from me versus something that I get to do myself as an individual.
And as an equal participant, because all of this essentially presents sexuality as something that is to be consumed by men and not as something that is experienced by both parties in the scene. But yeah, going like that being the very obvious like like shitty thing in Bollywood, like there's also the element of like action oriented plot like growth versus like a more emotion oriented plot growth. And I think Bollywood is like just like a special case where rom-coms are somehow more sexist than like even just like action movies. And you just have these, like, whether you're thinking about DDLJ, Mohabate, or like just any other like famous like Shah Rukh Khan movie, like it's like Shah Rukh Khan is like the king of like rom-coms, and like yet none of the movies that he's in, like the women don't have any agency in any of these movies. Where like like thinking about DDLJ specifically, like Kajol's character wants to go on a trip because like she finished college, she wants to go on a trip before like Amrish Puri like marries her off somewhere else. But yeah, like Kajol like wants to go on a trip, and that is the end of her like motivations as a character. After that point, she just becomes forsaken to this like to like essentially like whatever the men want from her in the story, whether it's her dad wanting to protect her and get her into a sanskari marriage, or Shah Rukh Khan wanting to win her over even when she like very clearly like objects to it. That like like horrible train scene, what the fuck was that?
Yeah, Bollywood rom-com heroines just don't get any choice in like loving the male lead. They just are supposed to be automatically in love with them. Like it's just a given. They're just waiting for someone to convince them that this man is like worth it, right?
Yeah, and I think it's just like so weird how like we're essentially told that, oh yeah, like she just, when she says no she means yes, you just haven't asked enough, which is like such a horrible message to spread to like everyone, that oh, if a girl says no, you're just not trying hard enough. Which is like, what?
You
Oh
just
my
have to
god.
harass her until she like
Yeah.
agrees. And I mean, we all know women who've had these experiences in real life, right? You've probably had it, like having rejected someone and then having them harass you. It's definitely happened to me. It's happened to all of our friends.
Yeah, like or like the whole phenomena of like eve teasing in like South Asia, like it's so prominent, it's so fucked up. You have all these like grown ass men who stand outside of like girls' schools and like wait to harass these teenage girls, these underage girls, and there's like little to no action from like authority figures. And this is like that's the thing, like Bollywood perpetuates this type of like behavior when you're telling men that like, oh, when you set your eyes on a girl, she belongs to you.
Just because you looked at her, now she belongs to you. Yeah, it's essentially that.
Yeah, and like what does that say for the women like in the like in like not just in the movies but in like reality? It's like, oh, you don't get a choice. I picked you. You just have to say yes like after I harass you. And I'm like, ugh.
And this is just to, like, I think, show how the male gaze really kind of has that effect into real life. It's really not limited to these movies or these TV shows or even any other kind of art. They really impact how we perceive each other as individuals. And just as a disclaimer, since we talked about the male and the feminine gaze earlier, the feminine gaze isn't about objectifying men. It's not about making a pink branded male gaze.
Yeah, and it's not about like women taking on the roles of men. Like it's its own thing. And I think that should be recognized that oh, just because you see like a gratuitous ab shot or like an ass shot for like some really hot dude doesn't mean that that is like the female gaze or the feminine gaze.
I think one of the most interesting things about the feminine gaze is that all of the characters can be the main character or like the subject of any given scene. It really equalizes each and every one of the characters by giving them that depth and that like holistic individuality. And this is something we rarely see in the male gaze, where like there's a very clear defined main character.
Yeah, and like the marginalized characters are often constricted by the plot due to their like identities. It's like, oh, you're the woman. Go like, just show up when you the main male character like wins something, or you're the marginalized character. Be there for comedic relief. You're just like relegated to these like roles where you are not even allowed to ever become the subject of the movie. And this happens in movies where like women and marginalized characters are the like are the subject of the plot sometimes, like where you have like oh like a rom-com where it's like oh it's about this like girl, but then you end up having like her opinions and her desires never playing a role beyond just like accepting the male character's like desires. And I think yeah, like that is like bad. And so yeah, we just wanted to make that disclaimer that when we're talking about the feminine gaze, we are not just when we're not talking about the sexualization of men like in return. Not that it isn't great to see, but I mean it's just like let's not have we can have people look hot on screen without them being the objects of the screen. That's all we're saying.
I think one of the interesting things that I think the feminine gaze also does is that people can look hot or people can look good without necessarily being sexualized, which we don't really see in the male gaze. Or I think the feminine gaze can display sex or talk about sex without sexualizing it. And I think one of the
Hmm.
great examples of that is in Lipstick Under My Burqa, which was really critically acclaimed as, a great feminist movie. And one of the really amazing things about Lipstick Under My Burqa is the narrative structure, or the tool that they're using. It's a female narrated erotica, which is essentially using the female perspective and contextualizing pleasure to the female perspective, which in turn feminizes the audience and empowers the female characters as well.
Yeah, and I think there's also like an added level of like just like that I really enjoyed in it. Like I don't speak Hindi, but the fact that this was in Hindi also like made it like really like empowering in a way for me, because I think oftentimes when like like audiences in like a more upper class, upper caste, and like just like more like privileged social groups and whatnot, like they often experience sexuality in like English,
Oh
like, oh,
yeah.
you fuck someone, you bang someone, you do this, that, whatnot. But sexual desire, or like the words for sexual desire for women is often still like considered more dirty, like even in English. And to have it, to get to hear it, whether it is in metaphors or just in general in Hindi, is also just making it so much more like just like, oh yeah, this is okay. Like a woman is telling this story, this is her sexuality, and it's okay for her to experience this. I think that being the framing device was just so empowering for so many reasons.
Yeah, I think some of the words that they were like using in the narrative, just the background narrative, were like words that we don't really even hear. Like there aren't like really any stories being told from that perspective as such.
Yeah, and I think like another great thing about Lipstick Under My Burkha is that the while like the women characters were the most prominent characters and the male characters existed in relationship to them, which isn't bad because like the show is about them, but their characterhood is never diminished the same way like a female character's is in like a rom-com or like a movie where the male, like the main character, is like a cishet male. And we see this in the scene where like Leela's like fiance, like the one that she's cheating on constantly, like he finds out that she's cheating on him, and we get to see like he's never reduced to just like an object that is there to be like treated badly. We get to see like his hopes and aspirations around like their marriage. We get to see him show her like their home, where they would want to go, the car that he gets for her, the phone that he gets for, like these dreams that surround her. And that's the thing that even the feminine gaze that is exemplified in this is that, oh, like even when the characters aren't the protagonists, their stories can still be valuable when their agency and their motivations are like and their aspirations are fleshed out.
Yeah, I think one of the, as you mentioned, that like this flexibility that any character can become the subject, and any character can, their feelings, their motivations can be shown. This is true even of negative characters in, when we're watching movies that employ the feminine gaze, because Konkana Sen's husband, whenever he's in the scenes, there's very little negative space around him. I think it's like that metaphor for how much he takes up space when in their home life, in her life overall.
And I think like he also like like he has a very specific way, like the camera creates so much tension when he's in a scene,
Oh
and
yeah.
it like it almost like accentuates these sort of little things that he does, and like just like how he like is insecure about just every little thing that she might do, or like if she like looks a certain way, goes somewhere, like this like the great how it like grates him like slowly, and just like the toxic masculinity of it is like accentuated. And that's the thing that like even a negative character gets to have like to be fleshed out in like under the feminine gaze. And that's like we in this movie we get to see both sympathetic portrayals of the men that are related to the women here, and also like negative portrayals as well.
Just to contrast all of our compliments to Lipstick Under My Burqa, I think one of the movies we watched for this episode that really was disappointing in that regard of having, fully fleshed out characters was Veer the Wedding, where the men and the women, neither of the characters seem to have like fully fleshed out motivations. We never get like a thorough examination of why they're doing what they're doing. Like one of the examples is when Karina Kapoor is getting engaged, like in the first 5 or 10 minutes of the movie, her fiance is just like, oh, I'm a Desi man, so I have to be married. Like,
Yeah,
it's
like
just, there's no context to that. It's just a given. He's a man, so he needs a babysitter, so he must get a wife.
yeah, and that's the thing that the men in this like movie have dialogues, but their characters and motivations are just never developed. And even the women's motivations are never examined that well. It often seems very surface level and prone to like many of the failings of like boss babe feminism, which is like, like just glass ceilings without like, like, oh, we are breaking glass ceilings, but we're not like doing anything to change anything for anyone else. It's very individualistic. And like I think that that's like something that we see a lot in these like sort of like, now that Bollywood's realized that feminism is marketable, all we get to see is this like this iteration of like boss based feminism, and it's very capitalistic in its roots, right? It's like, oh, like you are gonna work hard, you are gonna break a glass ceiling, fuck everyone else, fuck all the other women. It's just hashtag not like other girls, like times 10. And it's also very class and caste blind.
Yeah, I think Veer the Wedding never really contextualizes the events that are happening in the movie to the local context. I think I mean, we'll talk a bit later about this, but there are a lot of classist and casteist sort of overtones that are very obvious. And I think it really lacks that intersectional examination of privilege as well. And this is something, for some of our background research, we decided to watch Karina Kapoor's podcast as well, which is called What Women Want. And I mean, I don't think it really embodies anything that women really want.
Yeah, and look, it's just like really weird how like majority of the cast members were just like her like family members, which is like again nepotism. Like I guess we're not talking about that. Like women clearly want nepotism in this reality, but yeah, half of the people are her family members. I mean, I get it. The point of the podcast is to get a inside look at like it's, we all want to have that sort of like, oh, how do celebrities talk to each other, and I get it, but it's also like the marketing was so like like based on like this like buzz babe feminism marketing, which I think like kind of cheapens like what it ends up like doing. um
It
yeah.
especially cheapens what it ends up doing when, like, you're asking, a millennial youth icon actress, like, oh, do you like cooking? Are you domestic because you like cooking? I mean, that's such a isn't that just, women can like cooking without being domestic, women can be domestic without liking cooking. I mean, that
Yeah.
whole, like, that um the sort of like melding of the two is just really problematic and upsetting,
Yeah,
frankly.
and like there's the whole thing with like Saif Ali Khan's episode where she just kind of was like, "Oh, like how do you feel about actresses working?" Like he didn't grow up with a working actress like mother or something, and he's just like, "Oh no, it's fine. Like there's just certain things that women are better at doing." Like, and it's just like, okay, dude, like,
I think Sharmila Tagore's episode was actually probably the saving grace of the, like, podcast,
yeah.
where we actually got some intergenerational sort of insight into, like, how women's struggles, whether it's in Bollywood or in general, have, like, changed. But that was just like 10 minutes out of maybe 40 or 50 minutes of randomness that we watched.
Yeah, and like yeah, and I think this brings us into like our like next like section where like it's like about women's agency, motivations and challenges, and how these are portrayed in like media. Like either like good representations or like bad ones, or just like completely like none, and like just like how much humanity is brought to characters, and like whether they have any self-determination.
Yeah, I think, I mean, this is, again, we're not critiquing anyone here, like any of the cast members specifically. But Karina Kapoor's motivations for getting married, or like why she even says yes in the first place, is never like clarified. I mean, in the first 5 minutes of the movie, she says, I don't want to get married. And then we see her saying yes to getting married. And it just doesn't make any sense. Like,
Yeah, or like we don't even get to know like why she comes back after running away at like towards the end of the movie. Like it's just like, okay, like you're bummed out because what he said is like absolutely horrible. Why would you tell your like future spouse like your family's crazy like at the wedding? Like that is just like immediate red flag. But like why does she come back? Why is it all forgiven just because like, oh, like he's going through a hard time? Like again, it's just like what are her motivations like in all of this?
Yeah, pretty much. As soon as he's having a hard time, she just drops everything and comes back to help him out. Like, um, yeah, like, okay. I thought this was supposed to be a feminist movie.
And also, like, what do any of them do for a living other than Sonam Kapoor? Like, I don't know. I don't know if I'm just a bad like I didn't pay attention, but like, what do they do? Like,
No,
one of
I
them
have
is just
no
like,
idea. They all have money, but
yeah, no, like I feel like all that I retain from the movie is like, oh, this is just the Sex in the City tropes, like all over again. Like, oh, there's the one that and has sex. There's the one that is like a career bitch. And then there's the other one that's a fat friend. And then there's, like the Sarah Jessica Parker, like, oh, the glue of the whole group. Like it's just that. Like,
yeah, and their identities are never really, there's never any insight into their identities apart from these tropes. Like, sure, Sonam Kapoor, the career friend, is also sad about like not getting married, or like the fat friend is like, oh yeah, I have an interracial relationship. But none of the complexities of those things are ever really shown or like even discussed at all.
yeah, I think there's so much that could have been added to the character because they have like very interesting like family dynamics, right? Like Sonam Kapoor lives with a single mom, and like it could have been like, oh, like maybe like there's like they literally could have added like elements where it's like, oh yeah, like this is a single mother who raised her daughter who recognizes how hard it is to be a single mother in South Asia and doesn't want like a similar sort of existence with like scrutiny and everything for her daughter, and like not to justify the mother's actions but to like just add layers to like these women who are in the story, rather than it's like, and you can have Sonam Kapoor like, talk to her mom and be like, oh yeah mom, like, like I feel pretty confident that I can handle this. I understand that, you're coming from your own experiences where this has been bad, but like we just never get to see any of that like depth, like like even with the like interracial relationship like arc, and it's like, oh, he's just like a prop character, and her like thing is just like, oh, my like dad or grandfather won't like talk to me and like blah blah blah, and it's like, and you never go into like why the grandfather is like, oh, it's okay because now there's like a baby, and it's like, okay, that's simple. She could have gotten knocked up like 6 years ago,
I
like
mean,
if that's
yeah,
all it
like
took.
knocking women up is like a huge way of saving marriages in like South
And like
Asia.
family like trouble, like all family problem solvers, like, oh, just have a baby, like
Yeah.
beta, just have a baby, like everything will be sorted out. Like, yeah.
Oh my
Oh
gosh.
my god, like nobody wants to marry your dumbass son, dude. Like, just stop. Yeah.
And I mean, when we really get into these tropes, I think one of the worst things about what they do is that they binarize like feminism, or binarize what being a woman actually is. Like, the slutty friend can't be like anything but slutty. She's just a rich slutty friend. Like, that's her whole like character. Like, she likes to jerk off.
Again, we're not making fun of her. I think it's like sex positivity is important and we need it. Like, and like I've always said this, like when like 50 Shades of Grey came out, like I was just like, it may be a bad movie, but this is normalizing like watching sex on cinema, like in a mainstream way. And I think like portrayals like this are like still valuable because it's adding value, but it's also like boxing women into these like archetypes, right? And we see the same thing in like Four More Shots. Like you have the career competent friend, the fat one, the this one, the that one, and it's just like, as a fat person, like I feel like how these shows critique body image is also like really like surface level at best, I think, like.
And problematic, right? Because we constantly see even these like progressive feminist women characters in these movies making fun of their fat friend. Like, why does that need to happen?
And like it's almost like the fat like friend's job to like empower themselves, and like they don't even have I mean their families are bad, like, which, like, yeah, we all get that our families have been like really shitty to us about our weight and everything, but like we at least, I mean, if it's a feminist portrayal, like they could at least have like supportive friends. And you have like, I think in Veer the Wedding, that like they keep making fun of like the fat friend, which is like, like bad. And like
She
we're
just had
sorry,
a
we're not,
baby, dude. Like,
yeah, she just had a baby. And like again, like when we're using these terms, we're not trying to like dehumanize these women, but the thing is that like people, the ultimate effect that these like narratives create is just that like, oh, there are those four tropes again. Do I even need to know the names? There's the that this and that. And yeah, and I think like especially for like body image issues, I think it's also really weird how not in like Four More Shots, but in Really Wedding, like her clothing was almost very desexualizing versus like everybody else's clothes, which are just like, really glamorous and like they look super hot, versus the fat friend just being like covered completely.
yeah, like Sonam Kapoor can wear like, a crop top or a bikini top lehenga, but like the fat friend has to make sure like her, you know, abdomen is covered. Like that's really, it's problematic. I think Former Shots did a slightly better job on that front, where there was a moment of like, sexual empowerment for
Mm.
the fat
Hmm.
friend, where
And I think we need to see more things like that, where it's like you can like be like 200 pounds and still like be hot. You just have to know that there's always gonna be someone who's gonna find you hot, no matter what, how critical that your mom is being about you. And it's like not talking about myself, lol. But okay. Oh, but yeah, like I think that like I preferred Four More Shots over to Weirdly Weddings portrayal, like, as the resident like expert on this.
but
But
also like in terms of still like representation, I still think both of them were flawed in the sense that the so-called fat friend character wasn't actually fat. They were like a normal
yeah,
person. Like
yeah,
they were
they were
literally a normal
like
person.
my goal weight is like their like current weight, and it's just like it's
Pretty much, right? Like
yeah.
why? I mean, just I think that again, like it comes back to those like unrealistic beauty standards and all of those things. And I mean, yeah, I think body image and how it's dealt with has to be done sensitively, obviously, but also in a diverse way, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like, and that's the thing that, like, I feel like Former Shots ultimately tried to jam pack, like, so many, like, of, like, it's like a checklist that they had, like, oh, these are the feminist topics that we must address. And in trying to do so, I think it, like, almost ended up failing trying to execute it well. It's like, yeah, you hit a lot of points, but you didn't hit any of them well. And I think that's just what happened. And one example of that is how they brought up the struggles of being a single mom, but in, like, a really, like, superficial way.
Yeah, I think in Four More Shots, the single mom is kind of reduced to being like jealous and like hating like her ex-husband's new partner and all of those things. But um as a good example of like having a checklist of feminist issues and actually doing them justice was Made in Heaven, which also had a single mom who's sort of juggling her career and her like child, and having to deal with it alone without like financial support and all of those things.
Or even like or even support like from like just another partner in like raising like a child. Like it's like it takes a village, and it's like it just seems like she's just completely alone. And we see like some of the struggles that she has to face, and like whether she wants to stay with this like company where she gets paid very little, or like she should like moves on somewhere else, even though her the passion isn't the same for like this other project. And having to like prioritize her child over like herself. Like I think those are like it just felt like a much more nuanced like take on this.
And when we talk of like motherhood, one of the other things that we constantly see in media is this, relegating women beyond a certain age and making them completely desexualized and just kind of making them just the mother figure and like reducing their identity to just being maternal. And again, going back to Lipstick Under My Burqa, I think Ratna Pathak's character, Usha, taking agency of her sexuality as a woman who's supposed to be over, say, 50, was so empowering and so important to see, I think, because even as women, I think we're in our 20s right now, so we're still like at that point where we are being sexualized. But watching an older woman be in that position where she's taking that ownership was so empowering to see.
Yeah, because I think like as we like turn like 26 this year, like dun dun dun, like it's like I feel like I constantly feel like, oh, like I cannot be hot anymore because I am no longer like a sprightly like 16-year-old, which is like again like that's for another episode where we talk about just like the really like terrible that whole thing is just another part of the male gaze that is just absolutely awful. But like I think that it's just like really like we oftentimes when we see older women in on screen, it's always just, oh, a mother, a grandmother, or just like, someone who's about to die. And and I think that there's no like to see a woman who is not like 20 like two having a sexuality is just such an empowering image like to see on screen. And it's just like like I think that it's such a like it adds so much more layers to like these like characters who are often just relegated to just these maternal inanimate roles. And yeah, like I really enjoyed her character on Lipstick Under My Burqa. And I think like also like even like for other characters has been like really great too. Like I think Leela, the girl who was cheating on like like her like fiance and everything, like at her like engagement ceremony, she's like recording a sex tape by herself. And this like reversal of women taking control of a camera that is usually held by men to victimize women, like, and hold their sexualities hostage, is again like another like very powerful like portrayal that Lipstick Under My Burqa did, which like we often just never get to see.
I think Lipstick Under My Burqa does such a great job of giving women agency in the space that they have. And we see this again with like Konkana Sen's character too, where she even despite like being raped in her own home and being assaulted by her own husband, she is trying to exercise whatever little agency she can through getting contraception or like trying to buy condoms, or even just the fact that she's managed to have a career despite like lying to her husband is such a big deal. But going back to sort of the sexuality part of the thing, I think we discussed this earlier, that with the contrast of Leela and Konkana Sen's character, we see one woman in a position where like she's owning her pleasure, and then the other in a position where sex is something she just has to endure, and that's what she knows of sex. There's that particularly, I think it's a great scene where Leela and Konkana Sen, when they're in that space where she's like waxing her, and she asks her, "Oh, he never touches you like nicely, right?" And it's just showing that despite like both their like similarities, despite being in the same like area, they've still had such entirely different experiences with sexuality.
Yeah, and I think like Lipstick Under My Burqa just overall like just like I mean aside from like caste, I think which it just like does not touch on at all. Like I think it being like a super like microscopic look at this like the women that live in this particular like building. um I think it does a very good job of like telling like us about like just like how intersectionality of like experience like can like affect like women's lives, whether it's age, religion, or like socioeconomic class, and just like how all of this end up having very distinct effects on like your like lived experience. And I think like yeah, like this the one thing that we should always ask like when we're watching these movies is like, oh, are they showing a woman doing something for herself? And like are they showing like why they're doing something?
And I think when you ask that question, the movie that comes to my mind is actually Sir, which we also watched, um, where despite being limited by socioeconomic disprivilege, the lead of the movie, despite all of these limitations, still has like a fully fleshed out character with her own dreams and aspirations. We see her actions being self motivated, even when she's doing something for someone else in the movie. Those are still like things she's thought about, or is doing of her own volition. I think that's also really important.
Yeah, and I think like we get to see like that balance struck very well, that oh, she is limited by her like socioeconomic like place in society, but also at the same time we get to see her her being cognizant of her reality. So like yeah, she knows that she has to work at someone's house, but also she knows that she's doing this to keep her sister in school so that her sister doesn't have to do the same thing. We see how she reacts to like essentially being a widow in a village is like bad enough that I would rather want to come here to like do this, do like work at someone's home, even though that isn't like a big upgrade. But we see like the little things that she does to take ownership of like like just how this is like a better choice for her. Like we see her putting on her bangles that she as she like takes the bus from like her village to like
Oh
Bombay.
yeah.
And like and just like how she feels like that little more agency come in when she's allowed to like leave. And just these little details that this like movie like focuses on were just like I think such a good representation of like a woman examining her agency within the limits of like society,
Oh
and
yeah.
then also getting to like still have aspirations whether they're realized or not, like whether they think it'll be realized or not, having hopes and dreams for themselves and their family, like despite of it.
Yeah, and I think especially in the context of something like class or even caste, um, there's that balance that really needs to be struck between representing someone in an accurate way, because even within South Asia, women of different, like at different socioeconomic locations, are experiencing different issues entirely. And this is not to say that some issues are more important, but that society is actually really divided. And although I think we haven't really watched anything that specifically discusses caste, we really hope to in the future. And I think one of some of the movies we're like really looking forward to watching in terms of like caste awareness are maybe Masan and Gili Pucci, or even Fundry, which are some really great movies that actually discuss and contextualize caste oppression.
Yeah, and I think like since this episode is like a more broader look at some of the ideas that we are going to be talking about, like to address like class, I think like the ideas of class that we often consume in media, whether it's Bollywood or like Bangladeshi movies, like in like like what we refer to as like Tollywood in our area, but like class is often portrayed for like either like pure oppression or just like tactless humor. And there's sometimes we'll get the very classic story of like escaping like class oppression,
Mm-hmm.
and which exists in a lot of Bangladeshi movies, which is like, oh, like the hero is from like a working class background or is maybe from a village. He falls in love with like the rich man's like daughter, and then he gets to escape like class oppression. And that is like and but the general like sort of like end goal in those narratives is always becoming part of the upper class rather than like like questioning like, oh, why is my reality so bad. It's more just ends up being, oh, I escaped the hellhole, fuck you all. And I think the thing is that like class is never critically evaluated. Not that it needs to be in all movies, but in some movies I think we do need it. And like, if there were some movies that could even focus on like the uplifting of, the people of the places that these main characters come from, that would be great. Like, oh, if why did the working class hero not try to uplift the people that he worked with in like the factory? Like, oh, that never happened. He's just like, oh, now I'm rich now, like I'll just go off. And I think like, you know it doesn't have to be like super deep, but we can at least have characters who are aware of the fact that what is their reality is like bad. And I think that is something that we should expect from like these modern movies that claim to be like, better than their predecessors.
And I think this comes back to that idea of the gaze, right? Because it's not just limited to the masculine gaze or the feminine gaze, it's also the upper class gaze, or, the majority gaze in a lot of ways. And when we're looking at class, there are usually two portrayals that we see. And one of them is meant for that upper class gaze, the rich and the socially privileged. And one is for everyone else, and these sort of representations usually again reduce class to either depicting it as a class utopia with some perceived sense of equality, or we see this false sense of interclass solidarity, which is again like, it seems like a very manipulative tool almost when we see it from that upper class gaze, right?
Yeah, and like, or sometimes you just have the like, like the aspirational class fantasies as we talked about before. But ultimately, there's this idea of like meritocracy perpetuated in these like movies. That it's like,
Mm.
oh, if you work hard enough, or if you like are like, just dedicated enough, you can become like rich and you can join the upper class, which is never the reality, because the amount of work you put in will never like related to like whether you'll be able to escape your class reality. Like, you could work harder, you could be smarter than like so many people, and you'll never get ahead because you'll just never have had the opportunities.
Yeah, never had that access to like resources or networks or any of those things. And I mean, even for a movie like Sir, which is obviously still for an urban and upper class audience, um it still like definitely goes into like how class really impacts the main character's identity, and it like remarks on that class hierarchy with a lot of nuance, and even the idea of this urban alienation for this urban poor. And I think one of the most beautiful things that the movie does is it creates that sense of discomfort in us as an upper class audience, which forces us to really think about these class dynamics. I mean, why was it so wrong that someone who works as a domestic worker can fall in love with her employer? And I mean, obviously there are class dynamics and power dynamics here, but it really goes back to that idea of caste endogamy in South Asia and these like classes structures that pretty much do not allow, like, pretty much continue that segregation, that classist
Hmm.
casteist segregation, right?
Yeah, and I think that Bangladesh or like Pakistan or like the more Muslim majority parts of South Asia like to think that they're above like caste like issues and whatnot, which is not true, because there's still like an existing and large Dalit population in Bangladesh, even though they're Muslim. Like, caste discrimination just never ended, and like caste is literally in our like genes. It's really fucked up if you think about it, but it is. Like, and that's the thing, like when you oppress people for like thousands of years, like they're not going to be able to become like the rich upper class in society. So today's upper class in Bangladesh or most likely yesterday's upper caste people in like the olden days. Just because you've rebranded and you like, think that you're above it, doesn't mean it's not gone away in society. And I think like that's one of the other things in Sir, that yeah, like it was made for like an upper class audience ultimately, because all their releases were like in these foreign film festivals and then on Netflix. Like, this is not a movie that was made to empower the socially disadvantaged. This is not even a movie that the socially disadvantaged can see. This is a movie that was used that was a targeted for the upper class. But I mean, what is a good thing is that this was a movie used to challenge the upper class audiences like ideas of like class. Like, we've all grown up in South Asia where we just never question some of these like just like horrible ideas that are just entrenched in our everyday lives. It's like, oh, why is it that the domestic workers don't sit at the table with us? Why is it that some have different like utensils than us? Like, why are these things just so, why are we so okay with these things? Why are we so okay with just like dehumanizing these people who live like in our vicinity? And I think that Sir really pushes you to think about like, oh, why you are so uncomfortable about this relationship between this like the employer and like this domestic worker, and just makes us realize that, oh, the discomfort that we feel goes more than just the power dynamic issues. It's because of our like internal biases that we were like raised with, which is like entirely like fucked up. Like, and I don't know if the diaspora audience will like get just how horrible it is in South Asia, but it is absolutely disgusting. And there's been a lot of unlearning on all of our part, at least on like mine and Rekha's part, to like at least critically think about how we exist in society and like how our privilege benefits us.
Yeah, and I think Sir again does this like phenomenal job of really examining while making you uncomfortable, while challenging these notions. It also examines those power dynamics of class, through its cinematography, through the dialogue, even through just the visuals themselves. You really see how their relationship develops, but also the inequalities that exist within it. Something like the separation of space within their own house. Like, the rich guy, he has the whole house to himself, and she has like this tiny corner, and every time he's in her space, it feels like somewhat of a violation.
Yeah, and he's like takes up so much space. Like there's like this one scene where he's coming to like he's like coming to talk to her, and I think she's going to head off for her sister's wedding, which she's really upset about. And he like blocks the doorway, and her room is already so tiny, and the framing of that scene very specifically makes it seem like, oh, he still has so much power. And we see this over and over again, even in like other shots, like where he's like sitting and she's like behind. Like, he's always in the foreground of the scene and she's like in the background. And as their relationship develops, we see the like sort of that like give in a little bit where they start both entering the foreground of the scene. And I think cinematically those are just very subtle but very impactful choices for this movie, like to show not only in like the plot of the story but also in the filmmaking how like they are differently positioned, and how as the story progresses they like gain or like lose space, like to like become more of equals in a scenario, even though like there's still like a power dynamic problem, like which like obviously is there. But I think just the framing allows her to have a bit more power in the space than like what she did at the beginning of the movie.
And while we're not discounting the power dynamic and the the how it problematizes their relationship, I think the movie does a really great job of really subtly showcasing that power dynamic. Even say when the employer, he has his friends over and he's like talking to them in English, and that's completely alienating the main female lead, where she has no sort where she knows that they're talking about her, but she has no way to participate or even know what they're saying.
Yeah, and aside from the language, we also get to see like just like how like I mean like yeah, like I mean we were talking about power dynamics before, and I think like his insecurity and his savior complex like is very like prominently visible. And I think the movie like critiques it like in how it like is presented. Like, he has like these like typical sort of like male insecurities. Oh, my fiance left me, my job is like going badly, like even though my dad gave me the job, whatever. But like like, and I think like then the movie does a good job of like showing like how this power dynamic is also like uncomfortable, because we see like how overpowering and welcome his presence is in certain scenes where he's taking up all the space or blocking her like way of like, leaving the frame of the camera. But like ultimately at the end of the day, like he is still humanized because this is a movie that employs the feminine gaze, which is, like kudos, like good, that's a good thing.
Apart from being humanized, he also gets like some form of redemption in the end, right? Even though like he upsets her and he puts her in a really uncomfortable position, the plot still gives him a chance to sort of redeem himself a little bit. And that's again one of those very subtle things that the feminine gaze does.
And in contrast, I think it's ridiculous how Veer the Wedding somehow manages to be class insensitive while being completely class blind. Like, I don't know how they managed to accomplish like both at the same time. It's
Oh
just
my
like
god.
bad. The scene with Sonam Kapoor and her like the domestic worker at her house, like who was domestically abused, and it just gets reduced to this like fucking punchline where she's just like, oh, like, like I'll help you out, like I'll make sure you get a divorce. And then there's just like she's calling her yar and everything, and like it's supposed to be like, oh look, Sonam Kapoor is so great, she has such a friendly relationship with someone who's like more
She's
socioeconomically disadvantaged. But then it's like, yeah, but like you're getting to call her yar and tu and this that, but I bet that this person can do the same to Sunam Kapoor, and we don't even get to see it. We don't get to see like her domestic worker like use like the word tu or like yar with like Sonam Kapoor. That informality is never given to this person, where Sonam Kapoor is just like under this impression that she's just like completely like, class savior, like whatever, like kind of person.
Sonam Kapoor is actually like super classist in Veer the Wedding. Even after she hooks up with that guy at her friend's wedding, she has a problem because she refers to him as a dukandar, which is again like, I mean, the way she refers to him as a dukandar or
It's
shopkeeper,
derogatory.
and it's problematic because I mean, hey, you slept with him, right? Like, why this now? And I think that's sort of echoed even in, the contrast that they set between Karina Kapoor's family and her fiance's family, where it's kind of her fiance's family is supposed to be sort of new money. And it's weird that they specifically reference like an area in Delhi, West Delhi, where the stereotype actually is that these people are new money, sort of business people, and the stereotype is that they're like not classy and they're tacky. And
They felt the need to include something that problematic for comic relief, which is like,
yeah,
it's like a self-proclaimed feminist movie taking such like low shots at like when it comes to like class, and like all just like all the characters and their general unawareness of their identities and their privilege was just like so bad. Like I just like, and yeah, like it's just like ugh.
yeah, I mean, Sonam Kapoor with their like savior complex, but also I'm gonna go on a girls trip to Thailand because I can, like why the hell not?
And I think we see like a bit of that in like I mean like a lot of that in like four more shots where they're all super wealthy, and even the bar owner is supposed to be like independently wealthy somehow, even though like he was like the only person who seemed like, not wealthy at first, but then he's like rich too. And it's just like, this just speaks to the overall like problem of feminist media in South Asia lacking in class and caste awareness. Like it's just like it, yeah, it's bad.
And I think in contrast, like we see Made in Heaven does a really good job of sort of critiquing and examining those class dynamics in a really nuanced way. Even though, I mean, as Zoya Akhtar's style is, we do see, the elite lifestyle, but we also see a very considered sort of evaluation of class. Especially, I think, Jazz and Tara's character, um, both of them came from similar backgrounds where they were socioeconomically disadvantaged, but both of them had those dreams of like, escaping or like joining the upper class, so to say. And it really does a great job of showing how insidious these hierarchies are and how people keep sort of pushing this idea of meritocracy, and how just the idea of class is so closed off.
Yeah, and we see that with like Tara's character, like like in the scene at the beginning where she's like super angry at her staff for like the trays that the wrong trays are out at the party, and like this feeling of like constant imposter syndrome that exists because like she has this like constant pressure to fit into the like this family that she like married into and whatnot, and that's the thing that no matter like how well you dress or how you talk or like how much grooming that you end up doing, like we see those like grooming schools. It's like you're just never good enough because you can't, like class is never meant to be bought into because that's just something that's like shown, and it's like I think that is a criticism, like I mean it's a good criticism of it because often in these other class blind stories, class is always portrayed, or like like wealth is always portrayed as something that you could just work hard and enter, or if you just clean up here and there you'll be able to acquire wealth. But that is just not the reality. Like you see like her own like husband say like, oh, you showed your like akad, which means like, oh, you showed your like like class essentially, or like your like background. And it's just like yeah, or like just the character contrast between like Feza and like Tara, where like Tara is constantly held like like just to her like class identity, like, oh, like you're like if you don't dress a certain way, if you say a certain word, you'll just be like, oh yeah, oh, I knew you're gonna be that way. And I think this just goes to show how horrible like the classism is in South Asia, because essentially these upper class people create these barriers behind these financial paywalls and then reap the benefits of their own like in groups while not letting anybody else in and pretending that they would if you just worked hard enough, which is just not true.
And I think it also does such a great job of showing how, despite having maybe other like social disprivileges, class plays such an important role in that intersectionality of identity. Because Tara's best friend Karan, even though he's a gay man in India, he's still shown to be economically more privileged than, say, where Tara was from. And I think they did a really good job of like showing how class in both of those contexts had such a different role to play. Because despite being a gay man in India, he still gets to express his sexuality in certain limited contexts, and that is in part because of his class identity,
Yeah,
right?
and look, I think his class also allows him to fail, which is just never a privilege that Tara gets. Because when he like takes 2 crore, which is an insane amount of money, 2 crore is approximately, I think, like $200,000, like approximately. And the thing is that he's taking 2 crore like rupees from his like dad, and he like fails and like blows it all on this jazz club, and it's fine. But when like Jazz, like the girl who's employed at like Made in Heaven, when she like makes a purchase with this like credit card and she tells them that she'll pay them back, she just essentially gets thrown out. And like yeah, like she's given a second chance later, but the her repercussions for failing is so much higher than like Karan's repercussion for like failing.
All because of her class identity, right? Because she's economically disprivileged, she must be a thief, or she must be like trying to, you know, pull a fast one over like the rich people or something.
Yeah, and then yeah, and like when Karen fails or when Karen doesn't pay back like a loan shark, and like there's another element of like class like commentary with the loan shark that, oh, like people think that, oh, like you only have money if you belong to like a certain like like sort of like the few elite families in like South Asia and whatnot. But the person who's the loan shark, he like owns stocks and like shares in like the Khanna family like industries.
Oh yeah,
And
that was
yeah,
such a great I love that scene where he meets Tara's husband. That was such a great just that that balancing act of like interclass like relationships. That was so
yeah, and that's the thing
interesting.
that like all these people of these like elite whatever families will act like, oh, that you can become rich enough as us, and then you can like hang out with us and whatnot, and you can get the privileges of like being an elite whatever family in South Asia. But that's just not true. This dude is rich and he gets looked down on. And yeah, like it's
Yeah,
just
regardless. Like
yeah, the whole thing is just like absolutely like just, I mean, like I think Made in Heaven really made you like aware of like just like how much class is a hurdle, how much it is unfair, and how there is just like no truth to when like rich people say that, oh, you can live with us, or you can come be us if you like just work hard enough, which is like absolute bullshit.
Yeah, it really systematically breaks down that idea of the meritocracy, I think, and that's one of the reasons it was such a great show.
Yeah, and like I think like moving on like a little bit about like also Made in Heaven, like Made in Heaven was also a very like interesting depiction of like queerness and queer characters, which I think in comparison, when we look at like Four More Shots, where like I think Bonnie's character is by, um it has a decent exploration of like queer identities, but I think it's also like I felt like I was wondering like, oh, does it feel queer baity to a degree, because like like there's the part where it's the dual struggles of a woman coming to terms with her sexuality, but there's also the part where it like caters to the male gaze at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I also think, I mean, that exploration of, that dual struggle could have been done with a lot more like depth and consideration. I think why it came off a little queer is that they're like their like journeys of coming out just seem to like come into the plot as it deemed it convenient. It wasn't like, I mean, while it becomes like a main part of the plot at some points, it's just kind of relegated when like there's something else going on in the other characters' lives. So it's just like, oh yeah, look, queer representation, and then yeah, we're gonna focus on the straight characters now. So yeah, it
Yeah, like
feels a little clunky.
feels like it's like checking a box. And I think like what we want to discuss in our future episodes is like what is queer baiting in the South Asian context, because there's a difference between queer coded and queer baiting, and I think that is a discussion that we definitely want to save where we have like more time and like where we can pay more attention to it as well.
So, a few quick things that we want to quickly talk about before we end our episodes today are something that we saw in Netflix's Bulbbul, which is also, I think, in some ways a really good example of the feminine gaze. And I think Bulbbul has been critiqued a lot about just being, a female revenge fantasy or a female power fantasy, because the main character is sort of killing off these violent men in her village who are like all sexual assaulters and rapists. But also, while like it was empowering to watch regardless, we never see any systemic sort of change that this woman is trying to make. Like, despite being a victim of sexual assault herself, apart from killing men, she's not really doing much to like change how women are, like how safe women are, or like how protected they feel. It's very like, oh, this is the female version of Batman, and she's just gonna go around killing people but not actually do anything.
Yeah, it's like living out some like vigilante justice for while like just like not doing anything to make changes to the system. And yeah, like I think like that is obviously a very like right criticism of this movie. And like when we talk about the feminine gaze, like we're talking about like the cinematography of the movie, which I think like it was beautiful. It was absolutely stunning. And I think like it prioritizes like her character and I think like we see that in like these like little like details in like I think like especially in like the shots of her like her feet as a part
Oh
as a
yeah.
sort of like narrative tool. Like we see like when she's young, like when they put in that like ring, like the toe ring around her, it's like,
Yeah.
oh, this is supposed to like control you. And then when like like then when she's like running around and she's young and she's playful, we see her like like her again, this focus on her like feet. And then like and I think like after she gets like like you see like like her legs are broken, and so this like whole like her feet gets broken, I think, and it's just this like, oh, her power gets completely diminished, her freedom gets diminished. And when she becomes this like the vigilante, like going around like killing like all these like bad people, you see like her feet are turned like backwards, and just like just like, oh, how she's like a different person now, like, and like she's getting to do different things at this point. And I think just like that cinematography is like great, the focus on her as a character, her emotional arc, and her like agency and motivations is like great.
And there's also, I think, one of the critiques that needs to be made about Bulbul is also the amount of violence. Like there is like a 1.5 minute long rape scene in it, and of course we understand that violence against women and sexual assault is a very real reality, and films can and should utilize this issue to sort of, address it, to comment on it. But I think the question needs to be asked is, where does this violence ultimately end up catering to the male gaze? I think one of the other things that I found somewhat disturbing about um sort of the sexual assault like premise of Bulbul is that it's the differently abled character that ends up being the rapist, which is really weird for me because her like husband wasn't some like saint either. And it seems like a needlessly negative representation for differently abled people.
And this brings us to another representation that I think was like done poorly in Bulbul. Like I think like Bina Deni's character, who is the like the Choti Bahu of the like whole place and everything, like she like is just villainized completely, and like she should be, like obviously like she being an enabler of sexual violence is like almost equally bad. But the thing is that there's like a layer like there's like layers to examining these like dual roles of women as perpetrators and victims of the
Absolutely.
patriarchy. And I think this layered effect of oppression and enabling of like the patriarchy is something that needs to be handled with a bit more care when being shown in movies. Not to say that she needed to be portrayed like sympathetically entirely, but just to add that nuance to her character as like, oh, she's not just some like some evil person who's just needlessly doing this. Like there is like there's like a why to this, and like not to justify anything, but just to say that, oh, that the roles of women in society are often very like constricted, and I think there's a commentary to be made on that.
Yeah, I think women's part in oppressing other women is still coming from a place of oppression, and that sort of continued oppression is something that needs to be examined, and this is something we see Saas-Bahu serials sort of failing at all the time, where the mother-in-law is so vilified, like, or the daughter-in-law is so vilified without really examining the context in which their oppression exists and how themselves are, like, perpetuating misogyny for each other and responding to misogyny with misogyny, which is, yeah.
And I think like this is like we often see this a lot in like these like sort of like anti bashing like commentaries that a lot of like young women like to do. Like I think like yeah, like aunties, we've all come across that auntie who like a like got us busted or like has like talked shit enough about us that like it like negatively affected our like day-to-day lives. And the thing is that there's a difference between critiquing like the actions of these people and then stereotyping and fat shaming and like like desexualizing them, and essentially perpetuating your own like misogynistic sort of behavior against them. You can criticize their actions, and you can criticize like how it's like bad for you, but also this doesn't give you a pass to be like like just equally like misogynistic against them.
Yeah, no, I think when we see sort of older women I think their struggles still need to be contextualized, right? And this was also like a period piece. So, I mean, we're talking like maybe 150 years like ago at this point, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think even like the more contemporary Saas-Bahu serials just never do this like enough justice. And which is like ironic given like the biggest like the largest creator of like all these like Hindi serials are is like Ekta Kapoor, and you'd think having like a woman behind the lens for all these like works would like, create more empowering stories for women, but it just doesn't.
And it just goes to show, right, that like just having a female director or female writer doesn't mean you'll get like the feminine gaze. You could still get like a feminine packaged male gaze like media.
And I think like the last point that we want to hit on like with Bulbul, I think is that, like Bulbul is a primarily like Bulbul had a primarily Bengali cast. The premise was Bengali, the aesthetics were Bengali, but it feels weird how it was co-opted for like a Bollywood movie. Like I think there's this like overall general like North Indian like hegemony over like Indian media.
Yeah.
Like when we say like Indian media, we're always like, oh, Bollywood. And yeah, like our episode today is Bollywood because we know that more people have watched Bollywood than more people have watched like any Bangladeshi movie that I like watch. And like yeah, and that's why like our goal in this show is to talk about movies outside of Bollywood and also outside of like Hindi speaking like, just like films and shows. And I think that's something that we're excited to do because oftentimes like I think they treat our media is often treated like a monolith, and like Bollywood doesn't really do a great job of like representing other parts of like South Asia, and sometimes goes as far as to like co-opt it like for its own benefit.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to critique about, and I think it comes back to like our questions that we were asking at the beginning, like the degree. It's not just about like who's being represented, it's also how they're being represented, and like how their characters are being, fleshed out, having like personalities. And I think, just as a disclaimer, we did a lot of critiquing in this first episode, and we're going to continue to do so, but that doesn't mean that any of these movies weren't like fun to watch or they weren't entertaining. I think despite some of the elements being problematic, these movies were still really great. But again, I think I mentioned in the beginning that feminist media has to be held to a different standard because it's claiming to be feminist media. So it needs to challenge these problematic things and not perpetuate them.
As like just marginalized people than like women, we end up like just making ourselves feel bad for enjoying something like, oh,
Oh,
if it's
yeah.
problematic and whatnot. And it's like, I mean, obviously there's like a level to like, I'm qualifying this with like not like absolutely horrific shit, but like just in general, like the movies that we're talking about, none of them were like like horrendous or anything, and they were all super fun. Like they were like super fun to watch, and like it's completely chill like to like watch these things and like have fun with it. But when we talk about like feminist media, I think that while we want feminist medias to be like doing better, we also want mainstream media to be doing better too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that we enjoyed Sir and Made in Heaven and Lipstick Under My Burkha for its nuanced and diverse portrayals of women, and how they showed like women's agency and autonomy, and how they subverted the male gaze in their work. um and they were also really great due to their like nuanced takes on class and sexuality in cinema.
But I think on the other hand, it was a lot less impressive to see, some of these modern feminist narratives falling prey to the male gaze by perpetuating all of these negative tropes and like really class blind or class like insensitive narratives. And I think it was also really sad that feminism was like co-opted as this capitalist like marketing tool, without really furthering the conversation or adding to the cause of feminism or like gender equality in general.
Yeah, and we will be examining these movies and topics in depth over the upcoming episodes, not only examining the movies listed like in this episode, but also adding more diverse films and shows from other South Asian countries to complement the discussions.
While we've only talked about women in this current episode, I think our later episodes we really plan to tackle queer caste and class representation, and dedicate like a good amount of time to them and a good amount of analysis as well.
We'll be back in 2 weeks with our next episode talking about sex and sexualities in cinema, and we're available anywhere that podcasts are platformed.
Thank you for tuning in to our first episode. We're Saris on Screen, signing off.